So now we want to block the AI chat application if there's no active subscription, and instead we want to show this user interface, also known as the paywall. Now before doing that, let us first understand how the application is put together. I will be opening my Chrome DevTool to demonstrate how everything works. So let me go to the Network tab, and now if I try to interact with the app, then you can see that it is sending an API request to the backend. The backend is processing my request, and then it is coming up with a response that the user interface here is rendering. So to block that, what I need to do is essentially go to the backend of the application and do something there. For example, return an error JSON that will say that you don't have an active purchase, so you first need to subscribe in order to use the application. Now the backend of the application can be found in this file under src app API AI route.ts, and you can see it already has some sample code that works for blocking for some reasons. For example, if the user is not logged in, then the application will return an error JSON with code unauthenticated and some message. So what we want to do here is figure out if the currently logged in user has an active subscription. To do that, we will use the function that we created earlier, the get user entitlement. So we can go ahead and do this. Entitlement equals await get user entitlement. And this entitlement is essentially an active subscription. And if there are no active subscriptions, then we can return a JSON for the front end. Let's call it no active purchase, and also give a message. Great. And for the status code of the response, we can do 402, which means that payment is required. Let us save this file and try to interact with the app again. Now you see that the application is now showing me that there was an error generating the response. But we don't want to show just this error UI here. We want to trigger and open the paywall, as we can see in the screenshot. Now we need two things to show the paywall. One is a front-end component called Checkout Provider that will wrap our application, and then our application can show and trigger the paywall at any time. The next is a backend implementation for the checkout that will process the purchase as it happens. So all these are written in our documentation in details. We will share the link in the description. Now let us simply go ahead and start the integration process. It is going to be very simple. We will mostly copy pasting code from our documentation here. So the first step is to create the backend API endpoint. So for that, we have this section creating the checkout API endpoint. It is asking us to create this particular file. So let's go ahead and do that. The file is under app API checkout. Then we have the route handler, and I can copy paste the code from the documentation. And that's it. Now let's go ahead and create the front end component inside the components directory. We can call it app checkout provider.tsx. And as for the source code, I can again copy everything from the documentation. So with this, both our backend and front end implementation is ready. What every line of the code is doing, we will discuss in a moment. Let us first try to trigger the paywall and see how the flow looks like. Let's go to the component that is responsible to render this page here. We have inside the app directory chat/page.tsx. And this one is rendering the shell of the application. Appmen is the shell. Then we have the AI app, which is the client-side component that is responsible to render this application. Now I want to show the paywall inside the AI app. For that, I need to wrap it with the app checkout provider that we just created. Oops. Now the app checkout provider, it does require one checkout to be created by the backend. Because we are on Next.js and this is a server component, we can very easily instantiate our Freemius SDK and call the relevant functions. So let's see how creating a checkout looks like. So const checkout equals freemius dot checkout dot create. We can do a bunch of things here. So first we want the checkout to be in context of the logged in user. For that we can pass session.user to the create function. And we also want the checkout to be in the context of sandbox because we are testing things out. Now the create is an asynchronous function, so let us wait for the result. And now we can pass the checkout to the frontend component. Great. With this, our frontend is now able to render the checkout at any part of the application. Now let's get inside the AI app component. And to keep things a bit easy, you can see that this is also structured in a very simple way. So it renders the AI chat, which is responsible to uh, interact with the user. It is rendering the AI chat, which is responsible to render everything you see on the panel here. And it has an error handler called handle API error that can understand what the error code. It also has an API error handler called handle API error that can do things based on the error code being passed from the backend. So we do want to render the paywall here. For that, let's go ahead and do that. Now paywall is a component we get for free when using the Freemius starter kit. And we just need to render it like this, but it does require two props in order for this to work. One is the state and another one is the height paywall. So essentially the props are for the state management of the paywall component. Now we don't have to create the state managements ourselves. For that we can use the use paywall hook we get from the starter kit. And I can deconstruct the needed props. You might be wondering why I'm seeing this UI on the right. It's because the paywall is in a dirty state. So let us fix that by passing the relevant props. And now the UI is ready to trigger the paywall. So when do we want to show the paywall? As I am interacting with the chat, I get this error code from the backend, no active purchase. And when I get this error code from the backend, I want to pop open the paywall. For that, let's hook into this error handler function and call a setter on the paywall. I will again go back to the use paywall hook and get this setter show active purchase. And with this, our UI should show the paywall that we saw in the screenshot. So let's give it a go. The backend returned me no active purchase. The handle API error function was called, which triggered the show active purchase state function that ultimately showed me the paywall UI, as you can see. So with just this amount of code, we were able to render the paywall onto our application. And we were able to render it when the user is actually interacting with our app. Now let's see what happens if I click on the upgrade button. Let me clear the network tab just to understand how everything is put together. And I will click the upgrade button here. So this loaded the Freemius Checkout on top of our application. You can see that the checkout is loaded in the context of the logged in user because that's how we created the checkout. You can see the code here. The checkout is created in the context of the logged in user. The checkout is also in sandbox mode because that's what we did here. So this shows how the code translates to the UI we can see on the front end. Now, the checkout is also loaded in the context of the starter plan. In annual subscription mode, I can switch it to monthly if I want. It is also showing me social proofing UI like the money back guarantee and a review. Let's go ahead and make a purchase. And we will also keep an eye on the network tab to understand how things are being implemented. So what happened right after the purchase was successful is that we got to see a toast UI. Now the toast UI was implemented by our app checkout provider component here, that on after sync we want to show a success toast that said successfully updated your subscription, now you can continue using the app. We can also write anything here that we want. And what it did was it sent a backend request to this API endpoint on our application. So under API/checkout. And this backend request essentially called the process purchase info function that we wrote earlier, which saved the purchase information in our database and gave the user the credit that they deserve because of the purchase. Now, if I go to the credits and top-ups page, you can see I have 150 credits instead of just the 50 credits that I started with. Because I subscribed to the starter plan that has 100 credits per month, the system gave me 100 more credits, which summed up to be 150. So this concludes the integration of the paywall into our application, both from the backend and from the front end. But it is not quite done yet. So if I am trying to interact with my app again, you can see that the app still consumes credits. So let's do it twice. And if I go to the credits page, you can see now I have minus 50 credits. What happens if I continue the interaction? Well, this works. And if I go to the credits page again, it is showing me I have minus 150 credits. I don't really want that. What I want is I want to trigger the paywall, but instead of asking to subscribe, I want them to purchase one of the credit top-up plans. If you remember, in the beginning, we created the credit top-up plan, which has various bulk pricing to purchase credits in bulk. I want to show here a table that shows all of the available bulk credit top-up pricing, and I want the user to be able to make an one-off payment to purchase those. So how do I do that? First, let me go back to the backend. So here I want to do something more. Before deducting the credit, I want to check if the user has enough credits. And you can see that we have said that every interaction is consuming 100 credits. So it makes sense that I want to check if the user has 100 credits to begin with. And if not, then let's return another error JSON here that has the error code insufficient credits with the same status code of 402. Let me save this. So now I have negative credit, and if I'm trying to interact, this is now showing me that there was an error generating the response. So now we don't want to show the generic error message. Instead, we want to trigger the paywall, but in the context of the top-up plan. So how do we do that? The use paywall hook comes with another setter called show insufficient credits. So we can call it. And now if I'm interacting with the app, then this is now showing me the paywall from where I can purchase additional credits. So let us go ahead and do that. Again, we can check the network tab to understand what exactly is happening. So let's go ahead and purchase 1000 credits. Again, the checkout is loaded in the context of the user and in the sandbox environment. So I can go ahead and make this purchase. And as soon as the purchase was done, I can see the toast message here, and the system sent a backend request to the checkout API endpoint that we created on our SaaS, which called the process purchase info function that processed the purchase and gave me the credits. So if I now go to the credits page, you can see I have 850. So I went to some negative credits before, and if I add 1000 credit to it, then we have a total of 850 credits left. So now I should be able to interact with the application without having any issue. So this concludes the implementation of the checkout and paywall into our application. So we learned how to embed the paywall at any point of our application, how to trigger the checkout during interaction, and we did all this by using components that came with the Freemius starter kit. We leveraged the JavaScript SDK to implement the API endpoints or the backend implementation the starter kit requires, and that was it. Now in the next video, we will see how to embed a fully working customer portal into our application.